Hi, and welcome to Media Survey. This is lecture 3. By now you've met with Professor Scoggins a couple of times, and you've been reading chapters in the book. And so we're ready to move forward talking about communication theory. To start today, I want to read to you from Psalm 62 as a way to kind of center ourselves and remind ourselves that we are not alone. This is Psalm 62, the first 2 verses. This is a psalm written by King David. Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. I'm going to read that again and invite you to pause and remind your soul where it finds its rest. Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. God, I pray for these students that they will find rest for their souls in you, that they will experience that as a reality. And even though we are living through a year that is so tumultuous and devoid of peace, I pray that they will find rest for their souls in you and an unshakable confidence because you're their fortress. You surround them and protect them. And because you save them, because you rescue them, they don't have to save themselves or rescue themselves. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right, to start, I want to show you just a little movie because it's fun. Here it comes. This is called Monster Under My Bed.
Right. Good night, sweetie.
Daddy,
Yes, dear?
could you please help me check on the bed for monsters?
Sure, sweetie.
Dad, there's someone on my bed.
All right, I think that's fun. It's short. It shows you what media can do. All right, so we are in week 3 of Media Survey. We're talking today about the Barron textbook chapter 13, communication theories. So let's start with the question, what is mass communication theory? Mass communication theory is, it begins with a look at whether or not the mass media content, the stuff we consume, has any impact on us. And if it does, how do we understand how that works? How does it affect us? And so people have, over the years, thought about what does it do to people who live like we do, marinating in a soup of mass media content. Not only what does it do to us, but how does it do that? So those are the questions that we're trying to answer today. What variables influence the kind and strength of the effect? It seems to me that for people who want to impact culture for Christ by way of mass media, this is a question that really matters to us. If we're wanting to impact culture through media, we have to ask the question, is that a thing? Does mass media impact culture? If it does, how does it? And what are the variables that influence the kind of impact and the degree of impact? So these questions matter for us. We can say that mass communication theory is an attempt to explain how observed media effects happen. How do these effects that we observe actually come about? There are three different ways that we could ask this question. The book covers these. The first is we can look at micro level effects in contrast to macro level effects. What in the world does that mean? Well, it means micro level effects are effects on individuals. How am I personally impacted by the media I consume? In contrast to macro level effects, which would ask questions like, how is society as a whole impacted by the media it consumes? So during this year of 2020, a year of tumult, a year of craziness and unexpected things happening, we could say, how am I affected by the news that I consume? I would say just sort of anecdotally that I'm affected by it in multiple ways. I am informed about what's going on. I am made more anxious because of what I'm aware of, and also because there's a lot of contention that I'm made aware of and I observe in the news. A lot of people fighting with each other, saying mean things about each other. And I'm also motivated at times to take actions in response to what's going on in the world through the news, the information that comes to me through media. How else am I affected? Well, I watched a movie. For those of you who are with me in story genre and structure, you heard me describe the effect that the movie About Time had on me, that I found myself at the end of that film wrecked emotionally, weeping and moved. And in fact, the next day and up until this moment, I think I'm living my life somewhat differently, somewhat more aware of the beauty of life going on around me, the goodness of life going on around me, trying not to miss it, trying not to just be have the goodness of life blanked out by the anxieties of life. So I'm worried about what's going to happen next. I'm missing what's happening right now. And so I think on a micro level, I'm being affected by the media going on around me. Now, if we do an analysis of the impact of, say, the news in 2020 at a macro level, then we think of society. How is American society being affected by the types of news, the content of the news, the form of the news that is swirling around us? We know that the director of the FBI has warned Congress that the content, the media content swirling around us, is being influenced by Russian actors who, not stage actors, but people who are acting on behalf of the Russian government, on behalf of Vladimir Putin, to influence us during this election season, more broadly to impact our culture in a more long-lasting way, to be at each other's throats, to lose confidence in our democratic institutions, to weaken us as a democratic society. Now, whether those Russian actors can succeed at that and have macro level effects remains to be seen. We do seem to be pretty much at each other's throats, so maybe that's working, or maybe we just did that for ourselves. Communications theory thinks about these things and tries to provide reasonable answers based on evidence as well as reason. So that would be a micro versus macro level way of asking these questions about the impact of media. On the micro level, What is the impact on an individual? On the macro level, what's the impact on a society? But we could also ask these questions in a different way. We could ask using an administrative approach, or we could ask using a critical approach. What's the difference between the administrative and the critical approaches? The administrative approach looks for obvious short-term effects versus subtle long-term effects. So the obvious short-term effects of the War of the Worlds, which is a radio broadcast that was referenced in the text, was that some people actually believed that Earth was being invaded by forces from Mars, and they ran screaming into the streets. Those are obvious effects, and they're short-term effects. People didn't continue running into the streets day after day. It was just at the time of the broadcast. So that would be an administrative approach that would count up how many people ran screaming into the streets. A critical approach takes a longer-term view at the more subtle and lasting effects. What does it mean for us, the critical approach might ask, that we carry around a device like this all the time, and we're constantly getting pinged with headlines, messages? Do we lose the ability to focus in a sustained way without distraction? Do we in fact become addicted to that constant stimulation, and does it make us unable to sit still? That would be a critical approach to media, looking at the more subtle and long-term effects. And then third, we can take a transmissional perspective, or we can take a ritual perspective. Let's see if we can clarify the difference in those two things. A transmissional perspective thinks of a media message being transmitted with the goal of controlling the receiver, the audience. So what would be an example of that? If I said to you, before next week, I would like you to read chapter 14 in the Barron book, and we'll have a quiz when you come together with Professor Scoggins to check for your understanding. We could look at that, and then we could ask how many people actually read the chapter with care. We could measure that with the quiz, and we could then get some measure of the impact of that message on you. That is, in fact, a message I'll deliver at the end of this lecture, and we will, in fact, measure how that worked. That's the transmissional perspective. Somebody transmits a message, buy Coca-Cola. We can see how many people buy Coca-Cola. We're trying to influence or manipulate or control behavior. The ritual perspective is looking at something very different. It's looking at what we could call the representation of shared beliefs. So maybe we all watch the Super Bowl, and we see a team that gets down by 27 points in the first half, and they go off to halftime, and the announcers are talking about whether or not the team will be able to make halftime adjustments, whether or not the quarterback has the resilience to fight back. Maybe this team hasn't won a Super Bowl in decades, and they're up against a juggernaut of a football team that always wins. So it's a bit of a David and Goliath story. We start rooting for that underdog team. They come back. They're scrappy. They find a way to claw their way back into the game, and ultimately they win. And then we celebrate the virtues that are on display in that comeback performance. That's a representation of shared beliefs. It reinforces those beliefs we have in the David and Goliath narrative, it reinforces our sense of anything is possible, never give up. So if we are then evaluating what is the impact of that, we would then have to try to find a way to measure how much resilience do people in the audience have? Is that resilience affected by having watched that game? Tomorrow or the next day after they watch that game, when they encounter adversity, are they more likely to persevere with a belief that they can overcome than somebody who didn't watch that football game and wasn't exposed to that media messaging? That would be the ritual perspective. We'll talk about mass society theory, and in order to do that, we need to take a look at one of the media messages that gave rise to mass society theory in the first place, and that is War of the Worlds. So I want to play for you an excerpt from the original War of the Worlds radio broadcast, authored by Mr. Orson Welles. All right, here we go.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmuth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmuth's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet. We continue now with our piano interlude.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been handed a message that came in from Grover's Mill by telephone. Just one moment, please. At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill, their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition. The next voice you hear will be that of Brigadier General Montgomery Smith, commander of the state militia at Trenton, New Jersey.
I have been requested by the governor of New Jersey to place the counties of Mercer and Middlesex as far west as Princeton and east to Jamesburg under martial law. No one will be permitted to enter this area except by special pass issued by state or military authorities. 4 companies of state militia are proceeding from Trenton to Grover's Mill and will aid in the evacuation of homes within the range of military operations. Thank you.
You have just been listening to General Montgomery Smith, commanding the state militia at Trenton. In the meantime, further details of the catastrophe at Grover's Mill are coming in. The strange creatures, after unleashing their deadly assault, crawled back in their pit and made no attempt to prevent the efforts of the firemen to recover the bodies and extinguish the fire. The combined fire departments of Mercer County are fighting the flames which menace the entire countryside. We have been unable to establish any contact with our mobile unit at Grover's Mill, but we hope to be able to return you there at the earliest possible moment. In the meantime, we take you to... Just one moment, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been informed that we have finally established communication with an eyewitness of the tragedy. Professor Pearson has been located at a farmhouse near Grover's Mill, where he has established an emergency observation post. As a scientist, he will give you his explanation of the calamity. The next voice you hear will be that of Professor Pearson, brought to you by direct wire. Professor Pearson.
Of the creatures in the rocket cylinder at Grover's Mill, I can give you no authoritative information either as to their nature, their origin, or their purposes here on Earth. Of their destructive instrument, I might venture some conjectural explanation. For want of a better term, I shall refer to the mysterious weapon as a heat ray. It's all too evident that these creatures have scientific knowledge far in advance of our own. It's my guess that in some way they are able to generate an intense heat in a chamber of practically absolute non-conductivity. This intense heat they project in a parallel beam against any object they choose by means of a polished parabolic mirror of unknown composition, much as the mirror of a lighthouse projects a beam of light. That is my conjecture of the origin of the heat ray.
Thank you, Professor Pearson. Ladies and gentlemen, here is a bulletin from Trenton. It is a brief statement informing us that the charred body of Carl Phillips has been identified in a Trenton hospital. Now, here's another bulletin from Washington, D.C. The Office of the Director of the National Red Cross reports 10 units of Red Cross emergency workers have been assigned to the headquarters of the state militia, stationed outside of Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Here's a bulletin from State Police, Princeton Junction. The fires at Grover's Mill and vicinity are now under control. Scouts report all quiet in the pit, and there is no sign of life appearing from the mouth of the cylinder. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a special statement from Mr. Harry McDonald, Vice President in charge of operations.
We have received a request from the state militia of Trenton to place at their disposal our entire broadcasting facilities. In view of the gravity of the situation, and believing that radio has a responsibility to serve in the public interest at all times, we are turning over our facilities to the state militia at Trenton.
We take you now to the field headquarters of the state militia near Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
This is Captain Lansing of the Signal Corps, attached to the state militia, now engaged in military operations in the vicinity of Grover's Mill. Situation arising from the reported presence of certain individuals of unidentified nature is now under complete control. The cylindrical object, which lies in a pit directly below our position, surrounded on all sides by 8 battalions of infantry, without heavy field pieces, but adequately armed with rifles and machine guns. All cause for alarm, if such cause ever existed, is now entirely unjustified. The things, whatever they are, do not even venture to poke their heads above the pit. I can see their hiding place plainly in the glare of the searchlights here. With all their reported resources, these creatures can scarcely stand up against heavy machine gun fire. Anyway, it's an interesting outing for the troops. I can make out their khaki uniforms crossing back and forth in front of the lights. Looks almost like a real war. There appears to be some slight smoke in the woods bordering the Millstone River, probably fire started by campers. Well, we ought to see some action soon. One of the companies is deploying on the left flank. A quick thrust and it'll all be over. Now, wait a minute. I see something on top of the cylinder. No, it's nothing but a shadow. Now the troops are on the edge of the Wilmot farm. 7,000 armed men closing in on an old metal tube. A tub, rather. Well, wait, that wasn't a shadow. It's something moving. Solid metal, kind of a shield-like affair rising up out of the cylinder. It's going higher and higher. What? It's standing on legs, actually rearing up on a sort of metal framework. Now it's reaching above the trees and the searchlights are on it. Hold on.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
All right, so we will stop there. That gives you a nice taste of the War of the Worlds broadcast. I love the way that they include the piano interlude as Earth is being invaded by Mars. Just keep us amused, entertained while we're being slaughtered. So this brings us then to mass society theory. What does mass society theory hold? It holds that media are corrupting influences and average people like you and me are powerless to resist. If you take yourself back to the late 1940s, you can understand where this theory came from. We had just watched in the late 1930s, the rise of Adolf Hitler, a powerful speaker who whipped the German people into a frenzy, and by using his own speaking and the propaganda of his Nazi party, was able to get him voted into power and then overthrow all the democratic institutions and install himself as an all-powerful Führer in Germany. And so when media theorists looked at him and said, how in the world did he do that? In Germany, in the middle of the 20th century, a sophisticated Christian nation, how did this demagogue convince those people to follow him to their own destruction and give him the power to be a dictator? The theorists said, well, all we can tell you is that it was his use of media, and that media are a corrupting influence, and the average people of Germany, which are like the average people of America, were powerless to resist the force of his persuasion. And then media theorists took a close look at the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and they saw large numbers of people affected by what they heard on the radio, believing that it was true and acting in a panic, spilling from their homes, running into the streets. Media theorists were really impressed by that, and they said this proves what we have been saying about what happened in Germany, that in the face of persuasive media, people are powerless. Society is, we can think of it as one whole mass of people, and you can move that whole mass of people one way or the other based on where you push them with media. So that seemed persuasive. And then other people who were thinking about this question, how do media affect us, looked even more closely at the results of the War of the World broadcast that you just heard. And they said, wait a minute, you're telling me that 1 in 6 people ran into the streets after they heard this broadcast? What about the other 5 out of 6 who didn't run into the streets? Why didn't everyone react with panic? Why did only 1 in 6 run into the streets? What limited the effects of the media on the entire audience and kept it to only 1 in 6? So when we then look at mass society theory, where we're thinking about Nazi propaganda or the War of the Worlds broadcast, or the mob mentality that you see in Beauty and the Beast, where the mob comes together with torches and pitchforks and yells, "Kill the beast." That's sort of a great illustration for you to think of when you think of mass society theory. We then contrast that when we say, now wait a minute, however, not everybody was affected in the same way by the War of the Worlds. Only 1 in 6 responded with enough fear to take action. What explains the 5 in 6 who did not react that way, who were not swayed and made slaves of the power of this corrupting media message? What limited the effects of those theories and of that media? And then we start coming up with multiple different theories to explain not that there's no effect, but that the effect of media is limited by, well, by what? What prevents it from just enslaving us? There are a number of different ways that we try to explain this. One we call two-step flow theory. Think of Oprah's book club. Oprah reads a book, tells everybody that she loves the book. It goes into Oprah's book club, and only then does it become a bestseller. What's going on here? Well, you're familiar with the idea of influencers. Oprah is an influencer. The book is written, the book is published, it's doing okay. Oprah reads it, talks about it, puts it in her book club, and suddenly it's selling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies. My daughter is a pediatric nurse, my oldest daughter, Rachel, but she also started an online business with her husband selling children's clothes. And her strategy for selling children's clothes is not just to set up a website with pictures of cute kids wearing cute clothes, but to send free samples of those clothes to online influencers who have massive audiences who follow them and their little kids. When those influencers put the sample clothing on their children and then put them in their videos, my daughter's sales skyrocket. So this is an example of two-step flow theory. My daughter's influence is limited, but it's amplified when an intermediary joins in amplifying the message, and suddenly then the effects are greater. So two-step flow theory says you need that second step. It's the word of mouth that a movie gets. You go see a movie at the theater. Back in the olden days, in the old world, you would go to a theater to see a movie. You would tweet out your thoughts on it. This is fantastic, or this is terrible. You would text that, you'd message people, and the effects of that are either that suddenly a lot more people go see this movie, or people change their minds, and based on what they've heard from you and other people who influence them, they decide, yeah, I'll wait and see it when it's free on streaming. That's another example of the two steps of influence. There's another limited effects theory that's called attitude change theory. It looks at the way our attitudes change and the way our attitudes resist being changed. So you understand the resistance, because if I ask you who you're voting for President of the United States, or who you, if you're not a voter, who you hope is elected President of the United States, so get that kind of idea firmly in your mind where you're leaning. Now, if I come to you and say, give me 10 seconds, I want to change your mind about that and get you to vote for the other fella, you feel resistance. You say, good luck in 10 seconds getting me to change my conclusion about who should be our next president. Our attitudes actually are pretty resistant to being changed. Why is that? Well, we've got a number of ideas that fit within attitude change theory that help us to understand that. The first is dissonance theory. Dissonance is two sounds that don't fit together. So if I play two keys on the piano and they don't fit together, you hear the clash of those two tones. That's dissonance. And our brains don't like dissonance. They don't like clashing ideas to be held within the same noggin. And it's uncomfortable. So for example, if you, if you think well of, let's say, a musician, you love their music, and then I come to you and say, yeah, actually they are a domestic abuser. Now you've got two competing ideas, two clashing ideas inside your head. I love this person's music, and somebody's telling me that they are a violent abuser of somebody in their household. That's really uncomfortable. How do you resolve that? That brings us to these three selective strategies that we use. One is selective exposure. We try not to expose ourselves to messages that will clash with the attitudes that we already hold. So if you have MSNBC style attitudes, you're going to avoid watching Fox News because you'll be hearing things that clash with the attitudes that you hold. That will create dissonance or this discomfort from that clash of ideas. So you're just not going to watch Fox. You're going to stick with MSNBC. On the other hand, if you're a diehard Fox News watcher, Sean Hannity is your guy, then to watch Rachel Maddow is going to create dissonance because you're going to hear things that contradict and conflict with what Sean Hannity has told you. And so you're not going to tune in to Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. So you just don't expose yourself to those things. That's one way we protect ourselves from dissonance, and we insulate our attitudes from being changed. And so you can see how this is a limited effects theory. It limits the effects of media. Rachel Maddow can't influence you if you don't expose yourself to Rachel Maddow media. Sean Hannity can't influence you if you don't expose yourself to Sean Hannity style media. And then there's selective retention. If you do happen to hear something that clashes with the attitudes you already hold, you just forget it. You heard it, but it just kind of goes out of your mind. You don't latch onto it. You don't remember it. And that's the way you resolve the dissonance, the discomfort. This makes it really hard to change your attitudes. And then finally, there's selective perception. If you encounter a message that, let's say a headline goes by on Facebook that contains information that clashes with an attitude that you hold, you may not even perceive it. You may not even see it. I could ask you 10 seconds later, hey, have you seen this headline? And you might honestly be able to say, no, never saw that. It's because you actually blocked out perceiving information that threatens an attitude that you're holding. So this insulates people from having their attitudes changed by media messages. This is a real challenge for us as communicators who may want to influence values or attitudes or beliefs. And so we need to think of strategies as communicators. How do we get past those defenses? That's why I'm a storyteller. I think stories lower our defenses and communicate with us on a deeper level if we can avoid triggering those defenses. Now, if we flip it around and say, how do we as consumers of media not get locked into attitudes, values, and beliefs that might not be complete or might not be quite accurate, might not be faithful maps of reality? Maybe I've been rooting for the wrong presidential candidate. How will I ever know? I suppose I'm going to have to open myself up to voices outside of my bubble, voices that are going to be making me uncomfortable and telling me things I don't know. Something I do in the world of news to combat my own tendency toward selective exposure is I choose to expose myself to other things. I don't just get my news from one source, but I get my news from a wide range of sources. And if you saw the top of my browser with all my favorites bookmarked, you would see everything from Al Jazeera to the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, NPR, the BBC. I'm looking to bring in news from many different sources, even if it makes me uncomfortable, so that I don't get frozen in my existing attitudes. One of the effects of social media is to just reinforce the attitudes that you already have. So Facebook, for example, is really good at noticing what you like and what you read and offering you more of the same. They don't want you to be uncomfortable because they want you to stick around. They want your eyeballs on Facebook for as long as possible so they can keep offering you ads and charging advertisers for those ads they've put in front of you. So Facebook is going to reinforce selective exposure. It's going to do that step for you. How do you combat that? You got to find your news somewhere else. What about finding new music or movies or TV shows that are different from what you're used to watching? The suggestion engines are going to keep offering you more of the same. Whether those suggestion engines are in Spotify or Pandora, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime Video. So you may need to develop a strategy to say, what are the other great films or TV series? What's the other great music that is not being suggested to me that, or even it may not even be great, it may just be different and interesting and you may end up liking it. You've got to reach out for sources beyond a suggestion engine, which reinforces selective exposure. All right, so this attitude change theory, one of the key elements in what limits the effects of media. Then we get to agenda setting. Agenda setting looks at news, or this could also be movies, television shows, books, and it says that media may not tell you what to think, but by selecting which subjects it focuses on, it tells you what to think about. Are you thinking a lot about the civil wars that are happening on the continent of Africa? Probably not, because that is not a subject that is often put in front of you by media. You probably are thinking a lot about the presidential election. That's something that media of all kinds is putting in front of us. You probably are thinking a lot about racial justice. That's something that media is focusing on today. Certainly the coronavirus is something that gets a lot of media attention. Now, these are not things that are unimportant. And we would be aware of the presidential election even without media because it's part of our lives. It has an impact on our world. And there's an action for us to take in the first week of November, which is to vote. The pandemic actually affects our world, is in our world, and it's affecting our behavior. It's the reason that we're talking to each other through this recorded video instead of face-to-face. So those are things that exist apart from media, but media helps focus our attention on them. Mostly, the effect of that is it means that we are not aware of many other things that are going on in the world that are not the subject of media focus. Now, that's not because necessarily that the people who make those choices about what to focus on are wicked or are out to destroy America, but they're dependent on an audience. And they tell the kinds of stories that draw people's attention. So stories of conflict, stories of trouble, stories with high stakes, stories about blood and scandal, all of those things grab our attention. And we pay attention to those things. And so that leads to media offering us more of the same. So that's a big part of the reason we don't have more what people often pine for, which is what we would call good news. Today, this number of people didn't hate each other. Today, this number of people were kind to each other. Today, nurses and doctors cared for this number of people in a courageous and self-sacrificial way. Those are not breaking news stories. And so the agenda is set for what we think about. We can also strategically pull ourselves away from that and look for what else is going on in the world. If I want to be praying about the big stuff happening in the world, then I might go to a news source that is going to tell me what's going on in South America or in Africa or in the Middle East, because I recognize that most of the news media that I tune into is based in North America and Europe. That's why Al Jazeera is one of the news sources I go to. I found that it tends to be pretty reliable and it covers what's going on in the developing world at much greater depth than a lot of the typical North American and European media do. Next, social cognitive theory. The idea here is that people learn through watching other people. This is the way we all have learned as children. How do you know your first language? It could be English, it could be Spanish, it could be another language. How did you learn that? You didn't go to school to learn it. You learned your first language by observing. You heard the people around you speaking that language, and you pretty effortlessly picked it up. How do you know how to act at JP Catholic? Well, you watch the people around you. You watch the upperclassmen. You see what they're doing. You learn that way. We influence one another. We can also watch characters in media or actual humans in media, and we learn from their behavior, and we tend to mimic the behavior of the characters we see, especially the characters that we admire. All right, there's a whole other school of theory called critical cultural theory. This is a neo-Marxist approach, and the idea here is that people are oppressed by those who control culture. So you can think of Marx's ideas that the worker is in conflict with the factory owner. The person who owns the means of production has power over those who don't own the means of production. The people who own the factory have control over the people who work in the factory. Marx thought that it was important to address that, and he had thoughts about how you address that. When you take this lens and apply it to media, then the idea here is that the people who control mass media have control over people who don't own mass media. And so then you can evaluate media from that point of view. You can ask who controls culture today? How is that different now? And we could ask you, how is it different now than during your parents' growing up years or your parents' college years? I would say that one difference is that you have access to media that allows you to broadcast to the world. So while the ownership of the big media companies is getting concentrated in the way that we saw last week, there's also an opening up that allows you and millions and billions of people to be creators of culture, creators of media messages that are going out into the world. And so it's becoming more difficult for a dictator in many places. If they want to control their culture, they have to get control of social media because they recognize that media have impact. And if they let their people communicate with each other through social media, they're going to have a hard time controlling culture. So this is critical cultural theory. It's a look at power. Who has power over culture? All right, so just to kind of recap, it's a neo-Marxist approach that holds that people are oppressed by those who control culture. And critical cultural theory is the idea that media operate to support the status quo. What is that about? Well, if I'm in a place of control, that means I'm in a pretty sweet spot, and I don't want that to change. If I'm the owner of big media conglomerates, that means I'm a rich fella. And so I like the system as it is. I am going to then want to conserve what exists today. I will support the status quo. The idea here is probably we're not going to get a lot of revolutionary messages out of any of our major news media, because all those major news media are major businesses. So that's how this theory thinks about that. News production research looks at how news comes out of these large corporations and what that has to do with power and with a desire to support the status quo. You don't have to believe this theory is right, but that's what this theory is. All right, news production research is the idea that economics distorts and biases news coverage toward those in power. I will post all of these notes on Moodle so that, or all of these slides, so you've got access to this. And then there's the meaning-making perspective. This is the last of the limited effects theories. The idea here is that there is symbolic interaction. So we're dealing in symbols. One thing stands for another thing. And that this symbolic interaction encourages audiences to perceive products. Think of a car. Think of whatever car you think is awesome as a symbol that has meaning beyond its function. Every car has the function of doing what? Transporting people, getting you from here to there. But don't you also kind of imagine that sitting in a really sweet red convertible BMW does a little bit more for you than getting you from here to there? It says something about you and the kind of person you are and how attractive you are and how people should think about you, because it is a symbol of what? A symbol of success, of taste, of coolness, of wealth. And so people should be attracted to the person who possesses that car, not because they need a ride to the grocery store, but they want to be a part of that life that is represented by that car. Well, our stories, our news, our media are filled with these symbols. And so when we watch or consume media, we're interacting not just with the sounds that come through Spotify, but with the ideas, with the symbols, with the meaning that that music is making, the values that it's reinforcing, the attitudes it's promoting. And here's a really important idea, I believe, from the book. The size of the effect of any individual media artifact, what in the world is that, an individual media artifact? Just one thing, a song, a television episode, a movie, a video game, a cartoon. The size of the effect of any one of those things matters much less than something else. And that something else is the direction of its steady contribution. In other words, any one movie or song, video game is going to have much less effect society-wide and even individually than all of the media combined, sort of the prevailing winds of all of the media combined. And that's a thing for us to really pay attention to, is what direction is the wind blowing? And if we're interested in, let's say we don't really love the way the wind is blowing, then one song, one movie, one television episode, one video game is probably going to do less than if we could have many of these individual media artifacts that begin blowing in a different direction. And that's where you come in. I'm a screenwriter. I can write one movie at a time, though I'm currently writing two at a time and I'm busy and not making as much progress on either as I wish. But I want all of you to go into the media making world, the professional world, and be contributing to the wind blowing in the direction of the spirit. That there would be more than just one or two individual media artifacts that come from me, but that there would be dozens and hundreds that would come from all of you over the courses of your careers that are blowing in the direction not of a political movement or in the direction of a behavior improvement program, but in the direction of life, of hope, of rescue, because God has broken into our world to find us and to bring us into his embrace, to heal our brokenness, to wipe away the shame and make us live. If you can contribute to media that blows in that direction, in all the multitudes of creative ways that you will, because of who you are, what your artistic voice is, and what your unique life experience is, then perhaps the wind can blow fresh in a way that that powers a move toward life rather than death, hope rather than despair, wisdom rather than folly. So that's why I do this. That's why I think you do this. And that's what this chapter means. That's its significance. How do media actually shape people? And what are the variables that affect how media shapes people? So we can think about media effects on a number of different things. We can think about media effects on violence, and there's been a lot of thought and a lot of noise about that. How do media affect violence? That's a question that can be studied. It's certainly something I think about as a writer of action films and thrillers. I don't just think about what are the impacts on the typical viewer, but I know that there are people who are not typical and who are not healthy in my audience, and I don't want to give them any encouragement, any wind in their sails to harm anybody. And so I think about that. What are media's effects on the way people use or abuse alcohol or drugs or guns? You guys know what a designated driver is. The designated driver is somebody who agrees not to drink because they are the driver for their group of friends. And this idea of the designated driver came from a group called MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And they were mad because their children had been killed by drunk drivers. And so they originated this concept of the designated driver. Now that's an idea, but that's an idea contained within this group of moms. The challenge is, how do you get that idea out into the brains and the behaviors of everyone? The special challenge there is you're wanting to get this behavior into a bar, into a party where people aren't necessarily thinking first about responsible behavior. So this was a real challenge. And the idea of the designated driver was disseminated through mass media. It came in messages that public service messages like commercials. It was something celebrities talked about on talk shows. It was something written about in newspapers. And it was something that characters did in movies and television shows. And I'm the designated driver. And it was something that you got comedy out of, people not wanting to be the designated driver, and that's funny. But it disseminated and normalized that idea, so it became an expectation that you pick a designated driver, and drunk driving deaths dropped as a result of that. There was an actual macro effect in society as a result of the media message: pick a designated driver if you're going to be drinking. All right, so those are the kinds of things we think about. Here's another one. We can think of racial and ethnic stereotyping. How often do we see a person of color who is a neurosurgeon? How often do we see someone of Mexican-American descent who is a drug dealer? What do those depictions tell us in terms of our stereotypes and biases? There's an effect of that. And so many actors of color will say, I only ever get auditions to play criminals. And I don't want to just keep putting that representation out and reinforcing that stereotype. So what a media theorist would look at that and study the effects. Media creators, we're not really media theorists. We are practitioners. We're people who make stuff. And so then I ask myself, that doesn't seem right. So what can I do to provide a much broader swath of depictions so that I do get that African-American neurosurgeon and the Latino attorney and all of those depictions. Not that every person of color is depicted as a saint, but that there is a wealth of depictions so that we have a wealth of stories. And what that allows us to do then, and what that begins to shape in our perceptions is, oh yeah, if I see a person of color, I can't tell you much about them. I'm going to have to get to know them, check it out, and find out the same as I do with a person who looks like me. If I see a person who looks like me, I don't go, criminal or brain surgeon. I just go, person. If I get to know them, I'll learn more. And by telling a greater wealth of stories and offering more diverse depictions in the media we create, we put people in a position to distance themselves from their prejudices and begin to get to know the person and find out, who is this person in front of me, rather than what is my stereotype, and I am going to then assume that you match the stereotype because that's just the only story I've ever heard. And that's where my brain has been programmed to go. What is the media, let's call it the mediated view of a Catholic priest? When we see a Catholic priest depicted in film or television, is that priest most likely to be portrayed as a safe person to have around young children, or as an abuser? I think that more often than not, the default is to go, Catholic priest, danger. And while there certainly is tragic evidence to support the idea that sometimes that happens, the evidence is also that the vast majority of Catholic priests are safe, honorable, wise, caring, generous people who live to serve Jesus and the people Jesus loves, which is everyone. That is also a place where you could provide a greater wealth of stories. What are the attitudes in media toward sexual identity and sexual behavior? Those are places where you may have something to contribute and to help shape our attitudes, values, and beliefs. I hope in the direction of Jesus, which is to love everyone. All right, so that gives you an idea of sort of the breadth of what we're talking about when we're talking about communications media theories. For next week, you will listen to the October 17th episode of KCRW's The Business and come to class prepared to describe something that you can put to use that you learned from the broadcast. So really be looking for something practical that you hear either in one of the stories or in the interview that you say, oh, that's actually information that's useful to me. And when you're with Professor Scoggins the week following the 17th, you'll have something to contribute in that live in-person conversation. You'll read Barron, chapter 14. This is a chapter about law and ethics. So it looks at what we can do, what the law protects and allows us to do in media, what we can't do, what the law prohibits in media, and what we should do. That's the ethical part. what is the right thing to do, the beneficial thing, the not harmful thing, the responsible thing. So that the chapter Law and Ethics is all about those things. There's no media use survey this week. And then I'll be back next week with lecture 4, and we can talk more about what you've read in the Law and Ethics chapter. You should show up to class with a strong suspicion that there could be a test on the content in chapter 13, and have your books with you in case it's an open book test. All right, I will see you next week.